Good morning, class. Today we're looking at a scandal. Now don't get too excited. History is full of gossip. Most of it deserves to stay buried. But every so often, a private scandal changes public history. It shows you who really has power and who only looks like they do. That's what happened in Germany in January 1938. At the top of the German military, two men fell in a matter of days. One was Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg, Hitler's war minister. The other was Colonel General Werner von Fritsch, commander-in-chief of the army. One case involved a young bride, a police file, and a very embarrassed Adolf Hitler. The other involved a blackmailer, the Gestapo, and a false accusation under Germany's laws against homosexual conduct. By the time it was over, both men were gone. The old war ministry was gone, and Hitler had taken direct command of the German armed forces. 6 weeks later, German troops marched into Austria. Class, pay attention here. The scandal didn't cause the Second World War by itself. History is rarely that tidy, but it did clear the path. It removed friction, and in a dictatorship, removing friction can be very dangerous. First, we need to understand the men involved. Blomberg was not an enemy of Hitler. Far from it. He had helped bring the German army into cooperation with the Nazi regime. He had accepted Hitler's leadership. He had supported German rearmament. He was useful. Fritsch was different. He was stiff, aristocratic, conservative, and deeply suspicious of the SS. He was not a Democrat. Let's not fool ourselves. But he represented the old officer corps, the kind of man who still believed the army was something separate from the Nazi Party. That distinction mattered. By late 1937, Hitler was already thinking beyond rearmament. He wanted expansion, Austria, Czechoslovakia, eventually more. On November 5, 1937, he gathered several senior military and foreign policy leaders and laid out his thinking. Germany needed living space. Its problems, he argued, couldn't be solved by economics alone. Force would be necessary. Some of the men in the room were alarmed, not because they loved peace, not because they had suddenly discovered liberal principles, but because they knew the map, they knew the army. They knew Britain and France might not stand aside forever. This is the part most people get wrong. The German generals didn't hesitate because they were noble. They hesitated because they were cautious. That's not the same thing. But to Hitler, caution looked like resistance. And then came Blomberg's bride. Blomberg was nearly 60. He was a widower. He had grown children. He also had one of the most powerful military offices in Europe. In September 1937, while walking in Berlin's Tiergarten, he met a young woman roughly 35 years younger than he was. Her name appears in different accounts as Erna Grun or Margareta Grun. I'm going to point that out because it matters. Even her name gets a little blurred in the telling. The file becomes more famous than the woman. Blomberg became infatuated, quickly, maybe foolishly. But foolishness is not rare in lonely men. I've seen generals make worse decisions over smaller matters. He wanted to marry her. There was a problem. As head of the armed forces, Hitler's consent was needed. Blomberg presented the matter carefully. His fiancée, he said, was a simple girl from the people. He worried that the officer class would look down on her. Hitler, who enjoyed posing as the enemy of aristocratic snobbery when it suited him, gave his approval. He even agreed to serve as a witness. Goering served as the other. So on January 12, 1938, Blomberg married her quietly in the war ministry. The wedding received only a small notice in the newspapers. No great celebration, no public display. And that silence matters, because almost immediately, Berlin began to whisper. According to later accounts, rumors spread in Berlin's underworld that one of their own had married the war minister. An anonymous call reached Fritsch. The Gestapo picked up the rumors. Then the Berlin police chief looked into the matter. What he found was dangerous. There was a police file. Now let's be careful here. The file reportedly made 3 damaging claims. First, that Blomberg's new wife had posed for pornographic photographs as a young woman. Second, that police had registered her as a prostitute. Third, that she had later come to police attention again over an accusation of theft from a client. Those were the claims. Not a neutral biography. Not the whole life of a woman. Claims in a police file, in a police state. But we don't have to trust the file as a moral judgment to understand its historical force. Hitler believed it was fatal. Goering believed it was useful. The officer corps would have considered it intolerable. That was enough. On January 24, 1938, Goering waited inside the Reich Chancellery with a brown file in his hand. Not a battle plan, not a treaty, not a map. A police file. Inside it was the past of the woman Germany's war minister had just married. When Hitler heard it, he was furious and embarrassed. That may have mattered even more. He had stood there as a witness at the wedding. Goering had too. Hitler had approved the marriage, smiled through the ceremony, and kissed the bride's hand. Now he looked like a fool. That mattered to him, more than it should have. But then, vanity often matters more in dictatorships than sensible men expect. There was another layer too. The file reportedly said the pornographic photographs had been taken by a man of Jewish and Czech origin. To Hitler, that made the scandal not just sexual, but racial. That tells us more about Hitler's mind than it tells us about the woman. Let me be clear. The ugliness here belongs mostly to the men using the file. To the officer corps, she was a disgrace. To Goering, she was opportunity. To Hitler, she was humiliation. To the police, she was a record. But to Blomberg, she was his wife. Goering tried to persuade him to annul the marriage. That would have solved the problem in the cold little world these men inhabited. Erase the woman, save the uniform. Blomberg refused. That doesn't make him a hero, but it does make him human. He resigned instead. Now Hitler had lost Blomberg. That was not necessarily what he wanted at first. Blomberg had been useful, loyal, manageable. But once the scandal broke, Hitler moved quickly. And Blomberg's fall created a second problem. Who would replace him? The obvious answer was Werner von Fritsch. That could not be allowed. Not by Himmler, not by Heydrich, and not, in the end, by Hitler. Fritsch was commander-in-chief of the army. He was a serious figure. He was also hostile to the SS and its growing power. Then an old accusation came back to life. Years earlier, a criminal blackmailer named Otto Schmidt had claimed that a senior officer had engaged in homosexual conduct and had paid to keep it quiet. Hitler had once dismissed the allegation. He had supposedly ordered the file destroyed, but Heydrich had kept a copy. Of course he had. Men like Heydrich understood the value of a damaging file. The file resurfaced. Schmidt identified Fritsch as the man. Fritsch denied it completely. The accusation was devastating. Under German law, homosexual conduct between men was criminal. In the officer corps, such a charge could ruin a man. But the details didn't fit. Schmidt described a man who smoked. Fritsch didn't smoke. He described clothing that didn't match. He used a rank Fritsch had not held at the time. Eventually, the accusation collapsed. The blackmailer had confused, or been encouraged to confuse, Fritsch with another officer whose name sounded similar. Fritsch was almost certainly innocent. But innocence is not always enough. Not when the people judging the case already know the result they want. So now Hitler had 2 scandals. One involved Blomberg's wife and a damaging police record. The other involved Fritsch and a false accusation. One was damaging enough to ruin a career. The other was false. but it nearly did the same. And together, they gave Hitler his opening. On February 4th, 1938, he announced a sweeping reorganization of the German military and diplomatic leadership. The War Ministry was abolished. In its place came the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, the High Command of the Armed Forces, and above it stood Hitler himself. He took direct command of the armed forces. 16 senior generals were retired. Dozens more were transferred. Foreign Minister Neurath was pushed aside and replaced by Joachim von Ribbentrop, a man far more willing to follow Hitler into danger. The official announcement made it sound orderly, administrative, necessary. That was the point. Dictatorships don't usually confess embarrassment. They issue reorganizations. Did the German newspapers print the sex scandals? No, not directly. The public did not read that the war minister's wife had a police record. They did not read that the commander-in-chief of the army had been accused in a homosexual blackmail case. Those details moved through rumor, through police channels, through army circles, through the Nazi leadership. The official story was much cleaner. New commands, new appointments. The Führer assumes command. Germany moves forward. I've seen this before. Not always in Germany, not always in wartime. The public explanation is often not entirely false. It's just missing the one fact that explains everything. Here, the sex was kept out of the papers. The power grab was printed as policy. 6 weeks later, German troops crossed into Austria. This was presented as destiny. Germans joining Germans, flags, crowds, speeches, all the usual theater. But the timing matters. Hitler had just removed or weakened key restraints inside the military and diplomatic leadership. He had humiliated the old army establishment. He had shown senior officers that reputation could be destroyed by a file. And he had placed himself directly over the armed forces. Austria came first, then Czechoslovakia, then Poland. Now let's not overstate the case. The Blomberg-Fritsch Affair did not cause the Second World War by itself. War came from Hitler's ideology, from rearmament, from territorial ambition, from anti-Semitism, from appeasement, from many failures, German and otherwise. But this affair mattered. It removed friction from the machine. Before January 1938, Hitler still had to work around certain old institutions. After February 1938, those institutions were weaker, more frightened, more obedient. That is how power often advances. Not all at once, not always with a dramatic speech. Sometimes it advances through scandal, paperwork, silence, and a few men deciding not to ask too many questions. So what do we make of the woman at the center of the first scandal? Carefully, I hope. We shouldn't let the police file become the whole person. That's more or less what the men around Hitler did. They saw a problem, then an embarrassment, then an opportunity. That tells us a lot about them. It tells us almost nothing about her. She did not reorganize the Wehrmacht. She did not invent the accusation against Fritsch. She did not march into Austria. Her past was discovered, framed, and used. That's the point. Blomberg left power. He stayed with her. He lived out the war in obscurity. In one sense, disgrace may have spared him something worse. Had he remained war minister through Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the wider war, he might have ended not in retirement, but in the dock at Nuremberg. I'm not saying this to excuse him. I'm saying it because if his career had continued, it was heading into very dark territory. So there we have it. A lonely field marshal met a young woman in the Tiergarten. A quiet wedding took place in the war ministry. A brown police file reached Goering's hands. Hitler panicked over humiliation. Heydrich's old file against Fritsch came back into play. A false accusation helped remove the commander-in-chief of the army. And behind the official reorganization, Hitler took direct command of Germany's armed forces. The scandal gave Hitler an opening. He used it. After February 1938, the German army was weaker as a restraint. Not gone, not broken, just weaker. And that was enough. That's enough for today.